Good afternoon and welcome to the CRCNA for Developing Northern Australia's second edition newsletter and webinar series on broadacre cropping in Northern Australia. CRCNA's mission is to boost the economy and well-being of communities in Northern Australia, and Northern Australia is that vast area above the Tropic of Capricorn covering Western Australia, Northern Territory and Queensland. CRCNA achieves this through co-investing in research-led, industry-led research projects in agriculture, food, health service delivery and traditional owner-led businesses in these fields. As part of this program, CRCNA has co-invested with GRDC and Cotton RDC in 5 cropping projects looking to bring broadacre cropping diversification options to either pastoral or sugarcane-dominated agricultural regions. These projects are all around halfway through their 3-year life, and each takes a different approach to investigating the introduction of a cropping system to existing grazing operations or the agronomic potential of new crops and varieties. This is our last of the 6 webinar series. The first 5, we had 30-minute webinars from each of the 5 projects. And this 6th webinar, we're hoping to bring in the collaborating farmers to provide that on-the-ground producer perspective. Our growers, currently the only grower I can start with is Simone. Simone, are you happy to kick on?
Sure, I can do that. Hello, hopefully everyone can hear me. I am actually Simone Cameron. I'm the Industry Development Officer for NT Farmers Association. So I oversee and support our industry, plant industry in the northern parts of the Northern Territory. So I'm representing our farmers today. So I guess what I'm here to do is to I do liaise with them on a regular basis and obviously help support them in their broadacre cropping pursuits, in particular what we're discussing today. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview of what we've experienced to date, and to do a little bit of a comparative around previous season 2019-2020 relative to this year. So in the 2019-2020 season, we had 6 growers that were involved in the project. And this season we have 12. A number of those are official partners, and then other extended partners as well, in the sense that they've expressed interest in being involved in doing some trial work around some of the project work. So currently to date in this year we have around 3,500 hectares of cotton that has been put in the ground, plus sorghum, mung beans and peanuts. And the mung beans, peanuts and cowpea were planted in Central Australia on a much smaller scale. The cotton is a mixture of both dry land, or what we're calling rain-fed cotton, and irrigated cotton, with most of the 3,500 hectares is rain-fed cotton. So we're working on a basis of around 80% rain-fed, 20% irrigated capacity. To date, we've had a really good typical wet season. So we are seeing the cotton crops performing typically as they should, and all growers at this point are happy with the projected forecast and estimated yields of what we might see this season. So we're currently estimating average yields of around 5 to 10 bales a hectare. Obviously the upper range of that would be those crops that are under irrigation. In the Edith Farms area, where some of the cotton is being currently grown, which is just say about 50 kilometres north of the Katherine area. This year there's been an average of around 1,500 millimetres of rain, which we know that's fairly significant volume of water that would typically represent you know, a fairly substantial irrigated cotton crop down in the southern regions. in comparison to last year, they did plant cotton. So this is their third season for putting cotton in under a dry land system. Last year they only received 450 millimetres of rain. So we're sort of in that triple zone already for this season. As I glance outside, there are clouds around, but it doesn't look like we're going to get too much more rain events up here in the top end. And our official wet season period ends this month, so we've only got another week to go. So as an example, that Edith Farms area planting last year had an average baling of around 1.9 bales per hectare. So it wasn't necessarily a very successful crop, but it was still, you know, a crop that we were able to get to maturation and to harvest. This year it's looking probably we'll get the estimated or the lower end again of around the 5 bales, but that's obviously quite significant difference. But obviously the rain events have helped that immensely. The addition to the achievements, or the addition to why we're looking at broadacre cropping in the northern parts of the Northern Territory, is its aim ultimately is for diversification. There's, you know, a lot of potential areas of available land, and pastoralists in particular were really looking to find another fit into their enterprise and to diversify their enterprise from livestock. And obviously that cotton is a good fit there with regard to, you know, a source of protein feed for cattle to finish them off in the drier parts of our season, because obviously we have a dedicated rainfall event period, and then we have a number of months which can be dry and quite challenging for our livestock producers. So the interest is there in that space. With regard to the other crops, so currently we have some peanuts being grown in Central Australia, and those peanuts have been staged in staggered events, with some being harvested already. We've had yields of around 2.9 to 5 tonnes a hectare, so that's looking really promising. Mung beans went okay. They did fall below average, but we did manage to get them to grow, and they did perform, give scope for potential there in the central parts of Australia. Sorghum was also planted in the Douglas Daly region, and is not long out from being harvested next week, sorghum grain. However, the challenge for the sorghum was the big fall armyworm did give that a little bit of a challenging time throughout its entirety. So it'll be interesting to see what yields actually come off that crop in the coming weeks. Issues. Look, this year it's been quite positive all in all. There was a concern in February. We had lots of overcast days. So there was concern with regard to the cotton that, you know, that we might get a bit of fruit load drop and flower drop. But interestingly, the cotton didn't seem to mind those grey days. So that was a bonus. And, you know, we haven't had any issues with major pest pressure or disease on the cotton, and only the fall armyworm having a nice old sunny time on sorghum. So all in all, our growers are very positive, and you know, we've actually got a number of other potential growers looking to consider broadacre cropping for the next coming season, which will kick off at the end of the tail end of this year. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Simone. That's really great to hear. We'll keep rotating through our growers, and I might ask Peter Foxwell. So we're going from Northern Territory down to Billawheeler.
Yeah, g'day, Peter here. We're just outside Rockhampton, so a little bit coastal from Billawheeler. At the moment, we've got some sesame, black sesame in that's coming to an end of its season. We're looking at harvesting probably another maybe 3 weeks away, 3 or 4 weeks away, as part of our Spicing Up the North trial. So we're just about to plant some of our winter crops as well. Some of the kalonji, fennel, and a couple of others there that are going to go in the ground very shortly. But on the farm, interested to hear Simone's comments about cotton and corn, and I mean they're our staple crops here. So we've got cotton that's almost ready to pick. We've got some mung beans in the ground, only planted about 3 weeks ago, which is interesting. It's quite late in our season, but the rain came late. The sesame had a dry start and a wetter finish. It's certainly not. I wouldn't call it wet, but we've had rain later in the season, which has probably extended our season for the sesame a little bit longer, and give us an opportunity to plant some mung beans, which are sort of separate from our trial work. That's just our standard year-to-year cropping rotation: cotton and corn and mung beans.
Great, thank you, Peter. Joe's one of our researchers with coffee and representing project up in the Gilbert region, as well as some other sites further south, north of Emeralds. Can you give the perspective of your producers, please, Joe? And do you want me to launch the video you have, or tell me when you want that and we'll give it a go?
Sure. You can launch the video, and the video is just of a strip trial that is run beside our trials at Kilcummin by the participating farmer Gordon Ricketts. And yeah, I think we're running trials in Kilcummin and 2 sites around Georgetown, as well as one additional site where we're looking at producing a range of different yield potentials across Northern Australia. And that way we have we can tease out, understand the traits that are required for improving yield stability. So not just the increasing yield, but actually maintaining a stable yield, and also looking at how how cropping can fit in and enhance the profitability of existing enterprises, which are predominantly beef. So there are many different crops that we could look at, but one of the most important things are to look at how cropping fits into the farming system, and in this case, beef being the predominant one. So that came through in all of our discussions with our growers when we were developing this project, was that we need to know what sort of traits are required for sorghum, which Peter Foxwell has sort of touched on how maize is a staple for him. In the north, maintaining biomass and ground cover is critical. So we need these staple crops, and we need them to be profitable. So we need to understand how to increase the reliability of those and increase the value of them. We're working with Radical Seeds who have identified some traits of high digestibility in sorghum, as well as some different maturity groups, along with our other commercial partners like Pioneer Seeds, who have given us the commercial varieties to also test. And we're really looking at how best to fit those existing germplasm, or what traits are needed in future germplasm to not only produce high and regular grain quality, but to enhance the profitability of the beef system. That can be through grazing the crop residues or high digestibility sorghum. And we have a range of different growers. Some have been cropping for many years, since the 80s, through to some very recent croppers. So we have very different requirements for knowledge from those farmers, and very different levels of input. So in Kilcummin, we have a trial that's entirely managed by the farmer, long strip trials where he can best understand how variability across his field matches with what we find in a very uniform site where we do our small plot trials, and understand how the stability of those traits, not just across season for that yield potential, but also within a field that is variable. There's a question come through about fall armyworm impacts in Georgetown this year. We actually had a terrible time last year with maize, and that was so bad that we lost the crop. And in fact, we didn't choose to plant maize because we didn't think we'd be able to manage fall armyworm. Since then, we've noticed in other regions that fall armyworm has become a major pest in sorghum as well. So we were very concerned about that. But fortunately, we have had fairly minimal damage at all in the sites in Georgetown, and next to none in Kilcummin. Now, I think we were talking to some entomologists just a couple of weeks ago, and we still have a lot to understand about the life cycle of the pest to make reliable understanding of why we have one year that is devastating and the next year is very minimal. Sorry, I got a bit off track there, but yeah, the experiences of our farmers, they have been to, and myself, has been to really learn how we can pair farmers' own research trials, large strip trials with small plot trials in central Queensland, and exploring how these new germplasm are actually as good, if not superior, to the existing germplasm. In the Gulf, in Gill River, where we have some newer croppers, the learnings there have been around trying to manage pests. So we've had some sponsorship from Waratah Fencing to put in exclusion fencing, and EE Muir to put in a bird scare to enable us to run our small plots trials. In the other side in Georgetown, where the grower has a lot more experience, has been cropping for over 8 years now, the experiences have been very interesting, and understanding how the soil in those environments, how we can improve water harvesting in those environments for greater outcomes. We think that is the lowest hanging fruit to improve reliability and profitability in those regions. Does that about cover it, or shall I give a bit of an update on this season?
Thanks, Joe. We might just keep moving through the groups, and we'll come back to further discussion later. There are a couple of questions, and we'll swing round back to those. I'll go to Lance. Brendan Fry was there, and he seems to have dropped off. I wonder if you could, Lance, if you might be able to discuss how you see talking to the Fries on Home Hill Station.
Yeah, no worries. Our trial site's about 5 k's from the homestead. We attend the trial site with high regularity this season, so it's almost weekly. Sometimes we stretch it out to fortnightly. And the standard practice, we do a bit of a shuttle service for the Fries from the the shops and service centres, etc., on the tableland. So whenever but the two others involved in the trial, Laurie and Charlie, go to the trial site, they ring the property owner, the Fries, first, and typically they do a bit of a shopping trip in town and take equipment down, spare parts, etc. So
Thanks. Do you see that as an issue with the remote farming, then, that there's a need to get supplies to properties on a regular basis?
Oh yeah, it's a you know, anybody that's done trial work from a distance knows that the the difficulty is just skyrockets. You know, an example could be the sesame that we've been trialling up there. It gets one of the major pests we've found is a leaf curler that can get in there, and within 5 or 6 days, it's bare earth almost. So they can wipe a trial out quite quickly. So, you know, if you're not there on a regular basis, you're just not going to catch some of these things in time, and you can do a whole years of research in it. So, you know, that's I mean, we've always known that, but so we do try and get there on a weekly basis. We actually run the trial. I think the word's proscriptive. I meant to look that up, but we actually apply our pesticides not on a strictly best management practice basis, but on a covering ourselves for the next week basis. So we'll sometimes apply a pesticide before it's reached what we would normally consider a threshold, but just so that we know that we're going to get the trial through. So yeah, regular attendance at remote trials is, and it's one of the major costs of doing research in remote areas is just trying to get that attendance on a regular basis. Otherwise, you can lose the whole lot. I've seen lots of trials fall over when people have tried getting there every 3 or 4 weeks.
And that is scaled up when you're doing it commercially, I take. And when you're doing it commercially as a farmer, then that issue is just scaled.
Yeah, well, the farmer is out walking through his fields on a regular basis. A good cropper is. Yeah, he's not trying to grow a crop and only going on out in the paddock once every 3 or 4 weeks or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, the problem's magnified because in replicated trials, they're relatively small, you know, they're non-commercial sizes. So, you know, a pest can get in there and wipe out a trial, whereas it may not have necessarily resulted in, you know, a big commercial loss on a broadacre scale. You know, it's just one of the implications of replicated trial work. But just getting back to the original one, they consequently, for all of the above, have very regular contact with the fries, and that's excellent because that way they're actually aware of just what we're up to, you know, quite clearly, and we get good updates from them on what's going on, like what's happened through the week when we haven't been there, that we may not have noticed on our instrumentation. And we get the opportunity to give them feedback on what cropping operations they've got in place, because we go through them regularly and we typically duck in, have a look, and we end up having a yarn with them on a regular basis, just on how their operations are going.
Simone, there's a question about peanuts and the limitations of peanut.
Yeah. I guess to answer that question at this point in time, because it's very much a new space, where there's been 4 different varieties trialled down there under different pivots, and I couldn't tell you exactly which variety has fared better than another variety at this point in time, but I do know that there's definitely in the times that I've been down, and I've visited that property a number of times since October last year, you can certainly see differences in its vegetative growth in particular, and the pegging that it was doing. There were definitely differences in varieties across in the volume of pegging that was happening in the peanuts. The other interesting thing that we did note was obviously, understandably, in Central Australia, it's essential to have your soil water profile adequate, and it was evident at visits that I've made where the plants were stressed relative to whether, you know, that they had not received perhaps the irrigated, the pivot hadn't gone over this particular area of plants at the time, and they were really, you know, chasing some of that water that was going to be rolled over them. So very critical part of that management plan would be to assure that your moisture levels do stay up in the soil capacity. And the other interesting one was we did have some plants that were seemingly of the same variety that weren't faring as well visually. So we did do some sap sampling on those plants and found one of the micronutrients that appeared to be lacking in the plants that weren't doing so well was moly or molybdenum, whereas the plants that were okay, were firing along, so to speak. Their molybdenum levels were adequate, whereas the others were lacking. Now that was also attributed potentially. This particular plot of peanuts was grown on an old watermelon patch, and was potentially in an area where there was a bit of compaction from an old access laneway for the watermelon block. So again, you know, it was really much pointing down to making sure that, you know, you have good viability and good soil preparation for the peanuts to go into. So, you know, variety and water is key to making sure that they get good growth and good production potential out of the peanuts. But they are doing quite well, and you know, it's early days, but the grower is quite eager to continue to do staggered plantings of these peanuts, and that's another thing that they've done. They haven't necessarily planted all the pivots at the one time. They've staged their plantings to try and determine the best window for those peanuts to be planted in.
Further to that, Simon, I mean, peanuts have been grown quite successfully on a small scale down in Alice Springs, and large commercial plantings around that Kingaroy area, Katherine area, since the early 1900s.
That's right.
Russians. So you're now growing these in a different area in the sort of central belt, just south.
Yeah, so just south of the Devil's Marble area, or let's say it's about 160 kilometres south of Tennant Creek, in an area Ali Karung. Yeah, it's you know, and they also have had they've actually had quite a large volume of rainfall over that area in the January or October through to now, more so than they typically see as well. So there's been less pressure on that grower for his irrigation pivots to be running continuously, and I guess that's probably where there's been a little bit of a spike in some of those plants being a little bit overstressed at times, because we also the evaporation transpiration rates down in the central parts there is really quite high, and in that you know, November and January February period, that's also another big factor that can limit the volume of water that you can actually potentially get on your crop through that pivot system as well.
So that grower has a history of watermelons in that area, and it's quite unique. If anyone wants to go into Google Earth and do a search on Ali Karung, you'll find a very red part of Australia and find this little green dot right as you zoom in.
Yes, that's right.
So has that provided him with that background to the issue that Lance was talking about, that distance from resources and planning ahead, so when you're cropping in these areas?
Absolutely. I mean, we even experience it, as you know, Ian, in the Katherine area, and even anywhere, you know, up in the Northern Territory parts. It's definitely one of those areas that needs to be considered and thought through before endeavouring to do anything of a commercial scale. And as Lance mentioned, we've also had sesame plantings of a reasonable size here in the just south of Katherine, and also in the Douglas Daly area this season. So around the 40 to 50 hectare capacity, and they have, had challenges as well with the pest pressure that was mentioned by Lance. But yeah, so it's not something, we can't just duck down the road and grab something to help tackle the problem as it may present itself. So the growers have to be very well prepared, and also to make sure that they have they've done all their homework, so they actually also have a dedicated supply chain in which these products can go along down the chain into. Otherwise, it's just not a viable option for the effort that needs to go into to get the crops going. And perhaps that's where the peanuts in particular, and even the cotton to that extent. We have a cotton gin facility that is going to start its build in the coming months. So in June, earthworks will commence for a cotton gin just north of Katherine, and that's certainly increased interest in, supporting industry to ensure that these developing crops are actually there's an easier way to get those crops into down that supply chain.
Cool. I might swing back to Peter. Peter, you have a long history or knowledge of farming in that area where you are at. How are you finding these new crops that are being proposed? Not so much the new farming experience, but the new crops that are being proposed in these projects that you're running with CQU?
Ian, a lot of them fit pretty well into the systems we already have. So growing cotton or corn or mung beans or soybeans or a whole range of things that we've done over the years, we're using the same planter, we're using the same sprayer, we're using often the same harvester. So the equipment isn't necessarily different. The techniques of growing different crops in our soil that we understand don't vary a great deal. Most of the new, well, particularly the spices, I'd never heard of them before we got the seed. So, it's interesting to start from scratch with something, that we've never seen or heard of or tasted, but that's part of the enjoyment for me. But I think where we'll see successes is where we can fit the crops into our existing methods of doing things. So some of them maybe aren't grown historically using broadacre systems, but that's part of the challenge, I think, is maybe trying to adapt some of them to to fit into a broadacre scheme. So if we can do it on our farm on maybe a hectare or 5 hectares or 20 hectares, then it doesn't mean it means it could be probably easily transferred into 1,000 hectares somewhere in a block. So there's challenges, but I think there's always ways around the challenges that we've come across, at least up till now. But most of the crops have performed quite well under the systems we already have. So we're dryland predominantly on our broadacre systems, but some of the crops we've done some trickle irrigation, some we've done dryland, some we've done a mix of the two, some strategic irrigation. So yeah, I find it challenging and interesting, and whilst it's not dollars driven, it's probably educational driven, and from an industry perspective, then that keeps me enthusiastic about it. If there was a need to make money the first year that we're trying some of these things, well, none of these things would get tried. So, farmers just wouldn't be prepared to invest what needs to be invested to get new equipment. So you're going to have to fit in with what they've got.
Cool. I think Joe believes he can run his video around the radical seed trial, and you might be able to discuss this as the video is playing.
So this is the farmer managed trial at Kilcummin, and we have 9 hybrids. So you're looking at one hybrid strip now. You can see 12 rows there that are, it's 1 kilometre long. And the idea is that the participating farmer wanted to have some confidence in these small plot trials that may not pick up the soil variability across his farm. And we found this a particularly good way of assessing how those different genotypes would do across a field that is not uniform. And I think it's been not just a great opportunity to get, I guess, buy-in, some real engagement with our collaborators through these different types of trials, but also to enable us to understand those drivers of risk and variability in those sites. Last year we planted the trial and the cooperator harvested them. This year he's chosen to plant it himself and harvest it himself. Again, it's a side-by-side trial with the CRCNA funded small plots trials where we do the more detailed analysis. And yeah, I think it's been a real successful partnership, that component of the research. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Joe. Might follow on from that with a question I'll start with Lance, I guess. With those small strip trials that the CRCNA projects have been funding, how do you see the farmers and producers taking those results and then into a more commercial scale and giving them that confidence that you can scale up the results from that small strip trials?
Well, I guess the advantage of having a few different varieties is really helpful for them. It's okay for them to say, oh, let's have a crack at mung beans. You know, mung bean market looks good or whatever appeals to them. But if, you know, when we can actually provide them with the information from the trials to say, well, you know, we've had mung beans in this area for 3-4 successive years, and there's one particular variety that seems to be the one. So it gives them a bit of a head start, because without that, given the limited cropping history in the area, they can't sort of check out what their neighbour's been planting and go for that variety. They have to go cold, and there's a dearth of agronomists because of the lack of cropping in the area. So agronomists that they may be able to source don't necessarily have any experience to back up their decisions. So that's one of the direct benefits that, for example, the Fries have with the trial work and the results from the trial, is that it gives them a bit of a head start, and they can go for a variety which is shown to be, you know, to have the best potential in the area.
Well, I see, Graham, you've removed your mute. Do you want to have a comment on that?
Yeah, I should be more careful when I unmute, shouldn't I? Look, I think it's important, and to me, I guess the small plot work that we're doing, and part of that is looking towards validating the APSIM modelling, which may be useful to us to look at how crops may fit into the system. Obviously, broadacre planting, large-scale planting of crops is useful and helpful to see, and strip trials are all well and good too in that respect. But it takes a fair bit of commitment on the part of the grower to do that sort of thing. So I think some of the work that we're doing is certainly in the small plot work is identifying some of the issues that potentially could become major issues once we go to broadacre cropping too as well. The fact that we're looking at a range of crops too is helpful. So we've got the sesame, the mung beans, soybeans and cotton. I think one of the things that we have truly identified is one of the challenges around soybeans in this environment seems to be crop establishment. That is a significant issue for us. Cotton, we don't seem to have any issues around that, and the use of glyphosate to date has been particularly helpful in managing some of the weed issues that we potentially have. The other thing that we have identified, though, is if you've had Centro planted in the areas previously that you're going to put into cropping, that could become a significant issue for you in terms of weed management longer term. So there's a few of those sorts of things that we have been able to identify, which we've still got to then try and work out, well, like in a commercial context, how would we manage it? There are some limitations though. So for example, with small plot work, we don't necessarily have the equipment, particularly because we're a fairly remote area, to do some of the iterative cultivation that we'd like to do, which you can actually do in a commercial context. So there may be more options in a commercial context to do some weed management that you can't actually do in small plot work. So that's, yeah, there are some pluses and minuses both ways, actually.
Thanks. Simone,
And can I just add one more thing in there? One thing that the trial has that we have had made some inroads in is planting window. You know, if somebody wants to get into cropping, they typically, for example, in that area there, they would look at the wet season, the onset of the wet season. You want to get in before the wet season because of the implications if you don't, because you can't then get in till it stops raining. But we did find, and Graham mentioned it with soybeans, and it's also the case with mung beans, is this season we actually deliberately shifted the planting of the mung beans to nearly a month after we've been planting it up to date. And that's what we'll be doing with the soybeans, probably for very much the same reasons. And that's seems to be soil temperature. It's just deadly. We were using planting dates based on the meteorology, on the history of the place, but we now know we weren't putting enough emphasis on concern about the actual soil temperature. So, if you were doing broadacre planting and not to go before a certain soil temperature or certain date, it's big money. Good lesson learned on a small plot trial work that will be really valuable.
no, it sounds like we really need a living agronomy packages that are getting updated as all this new information is being collected. I'm going to slip back to the NT. Simon, you've talked about you've gone from 5 grower participants up to 12 this year. Are they getting the ability from small plots, or are they looking over the fence at what their neighbours are doing and wanting to jump on?
Okay, so I guess it's very much a little bit community driven. So we have a cohort of producers and innovative farmers, broadacre cropping farmers, if you like, in the Douglas Daly region. So whilst they might be they consider themselves all neighbours, there is, as you know, Ian, there's there can be anywhere up to 80 kilometres between producers, but they all what it has helped for our industry up here is conversations and actually allowed these farmers to feel that there is a sense of community and that there is people out there of similar interests and they can have conversations. They speak to each other a lot more now and meet in paddocks a lot more now than they have ever done. So that's really, it has closed the gap there, so to speak, with in terms of, isolation and thinking outside the square and looking to try different things and new things. I guess Lance mentioned, that capacity to have available equipment and the scope for, to be a broadacre cropping farmer. You do need to have some machinery and plant, and we have had those challenges. That's certainly a challenge for the 3 or 4 providers in the Central Australian area. So in that tea tree, Ali Karung area, those 2 of them in particular have just been hay producers, predominantly Rhodes grass and lucerne. So they have basic equipment, but they don't necessarily have the capacity for what's required in that broadacre cropping space. So that certainly, you know, will and does present challenges for them. And that's why I guess it's been more of a small scale trial perspective than actually large commercial entity. But there, you know, it has proved to be positive. Even the mung beans was planted in October last year on one property down there. Didn't establish, didn't go anywhere. They weren't keen to have another go of the mung beans, and the producer, which was 150 kilometres down the road, the other gentleman, he wasn't keen either, based on the neighbours in result. But we encouraged him to have a try and put in some cowpea, and obviously that was quite successful, and has been cut a couple of times now, getting around 6 tonnes a hectare for some hay production there. And the gentleman, other grower down the road, did put mung beans in, and they was quite late, so it was a bit of a outside that planting windows, very much so. And whilst the mung beans, you know, didn't fare average yields, I think we estimated, I did some quadrant picks, and it was around the 650 kilos per hectare. Weeds was a big issue, pressure of weeds in the crop, and obviously growing it outside of a window, which wasn't typically of a mung bean planting, but it still did produce, you know, a crop, and with very little input and effort put into that crop. So it's, you know, it's a positive step, and I do believe that the mung beans, a pivot of mung beans has been planted at the same farm where the watermelons and the peanuts are. So it'll be interesting to see, and that was planted in February. So it'll be interesting to see in that window that's the preferred window, how that does fare in the coming months.
Well, there is a question for Peter about control of weeds in sesame, and I know Larry spoke about the issues of weeds in his sesame. Before I let Peter answer that one a bit specifically for his situation, is there for you guys growing up in the northern areas and new cropping areas, do you think the weeds issue is very much the fact that you're just establishing cropping on what were previously rangeland grazed paddocks or something similar, and therefore there's a seed bank you have to get over? Is that a different issue? Or growing cotton where you have the Roundup Ready Flex technology helps as well? Who wants to start?
I guess I can, because we you know, the Katherine area in particular has a bit of a label of being a weedy problemed area, and so it has actually, I think this cropping space really does allow for you know, improved management practices around weed and weed control in both the grass areas and broadleaf areas. So I think it's important that as part of this, the bigger scope is that potential farmers have an opportunity to look at having a cropping rotational program that gets developed out of all of this, and what best fits their enterprise and what best fits their needs and requirements for their own sustainable production system. So I actually think it's really exciting that we actually have, you know, I think of a couple of different places around here that are fairly renowned and labelled for being issues for weed production, and I think it's really exciting that they now have an opportunity to help break some of that weed cycles that they actually have, and the viability of seed that they have, or seed banks they have in their earth. So yeah, it's a really exciting position for these guys, and that's why I think some of the interest is coming from them.
Sure. Lance or Graham, do you want to comment on your side?
Do you want to comment, Lance?
Yeah, well, Graham mentioned it before. We're doing trial work of legumes in a field where there was previously sown a legume pasture crop. So, you know, when that comes up in our trial, it's a bit of a challenge, and that goes again to what Graham mentioned about inter-row cultivation. you know, that's the lesson we learned there. There's the inter-row cultivation would have really helped address that, because we couldn't spray the legumes out in a legume crop. But definitely the seed bank issue, you know, successive crops, you prep and you're growing that crop, you're reducing the seed bank of the weeds each year. So you'll get to the point where they won't be, you know, you would hope to be getting on top of it from when you first started. But yeah, it's certainly it's obviously it's one of the major issues for people entering into cropping. The other one that I know people are doing work, including Joe and DAF themselves, are doing work on this issue that if somebody wants to have a go at cropping and they're going to spray out their pasture grasses, whether it's Flinders grass or whatever, they've made a commitment, because it takes a long time for that to come back up. So they've removed that part of their cattle operation when they spray that out, and so they're committed. So hence the work that's being done to try and look at how you can actually, you know, double back on yourself if you make that call, which makes it easy to go in to have a try, I guess.
I guess a comment that I'd make, one of the challenges I see in the north is there's quite a lot of potential weed growth with the rain and all the rest of it, but you also a heavy reliance on glyphosate as the only approach is not going to be a good outcome either, given the herbicide resistance that we have happening elsewhere in the country. So we do need to think about how we, and although cotton is good in the sense that we can use the Roundup Ready technology, we need to be careful not to overuse it too, because we could be creating a rod for our own back in the longer term.
And I think I agree, Graham. I think that's where the conversations that I know I've had personally have been very much about, you know, don't try not to, you know, to monoculture your pathway here. Really look to integrate other crops and other ideas into your program. I know a gentleman that put cotton in an area last year. This year he's gone back to grass in that area and just cut it for hay, and planted his dryland cotton somewhere else in another area of his property where he had cleared country. So it's good. It's just good to be able to have that opportunity to visually see that the impact of that, and also to have those opportunities for these guys to have conversations about things like that. It's really important for the industry development.
I think having those conversations and those relationships and conversations between growers and I guess facilitating that is going to be really, really important across the whole of the north, as well as conversations with potential agribusiness input suppliers too. So how that might work too would be interesting.
Joe, I might ask you for a comment, because your sites straddle the Gilbert catchment and then those areas further south as well. How have weeds varied between that geographical range for your projects?
We haven't had problems with weeds so far. We have, I think timing is everything. We have a lot of experience in how to implement these trials, and we have the chemistry available. We're not trialing new crops, we're trialing usually established crops. So we get in and we put the residual chemistries down, and we've been able to maybe just get lucky, but I hope there's a bit of skill that we've shown there, and that's we've been very lucky. It's a range of different methods. We had a lot of farmer input where all of the weed control was supplied by the farmer at one site. Another site we did 100% of it, and that's the brand new cropper. And the other site, there's a mix of the two. So using the farmer's own knowledge and some of our knowledge, and we've been able to pretty well get on top of the weeds. And that might be part of Simone's, what she's saying, that use the rotation, use those crops to clean up the paddock, then go into your crops that you know you have problems with.
Peter, I might switch back to you for that long-term farming experience then, and going into new crops. Do you find you have to change your management and different weed controls?
Yeah, well, generally, I mean, last year or two it's been dead easy. You don't if it doesn't rain, you don't get weeds. That's been a bit of an issue, but yeah, it's especially when we started with sesame, it was very difficult. There's nothing that was registered, so we had some battles with some different issues. So in all the new crops, we're starting off with just cultivation. So cultivating at planting, cultivating prior to planting, cultivating after the plants are up, intero-cultivating, and that works well. But that doesn't provide solutions long term for everybody. It works okay in our system because that's what we'll do with our corn, our cotton, and our beans and everything else. In our system, it works okay. But it's not a solution for any emerging industry. So the sooner that our small scale trials can be scaled up to include chemical work to look at registrations, and the better off everyone's going to be.
And I guess at that point, I'd make the point that we're certainly doing some preliminary work with trying to get some ABPMA registrations around some herbicide chemistry. That's work that Tony Matchett's sort of and AgriFutures have been involved in, trying to promote, and Michael Widrick here in DAF has been looking at that. At our site in Georgetown, Lance and the guys up there have actually been doing some very preliminary field evaluation of some of that chemistry as well, from what looks promising in the glass house. My comment would be, it's a way to go yet, Lance. It certainly seems to knock the sesame around a bit, but yeah, there are certainly some differences occurring on that site now where there's been some herbicide usage done. So, yeah.
Well, Graham, just when you and Lance get sesame sorted out, we'll move on to Kalonji.
Yeah, well, yeah. We won't go there, Peter. Not at this point in time, anyway.
Well, we've ticked over 2 o'clock there now, so that ends. It's our time for this webinar. I'd like to thank the panelists who've come on and provided their comments, and the participants who've been listening in, and to all those who listened into the whole series of 6 webinars that we've held. We look forward to doing this again in 18 months, and we'll see the final outcomes of these 5 projects, and where they've led and where to next for cropping in the north. So thank you for your time and your attendance, and happy farming. May it rain.
Mm-hmm.
It did.
Well, at the right time.
Thanks,
Ian.
Okay, we'll catch you later. See you, Peter.
Everyone. Bye.
Go. Bye, Simone.